Hello and welcome everyone to this episode of Stand Out. I'm your host, Evelyn Brink. And in this episode, I have the amazing Monica Day with me on the show. Monica is an instigator, and her tagline on her website says, liberating aliveness in a world gone numb. And what I love about Monica is that she's one of the most exciting women that you could ever talk to. Wild and dangerous and creative and artistic and a successful, powerful, super powerful coach and a priestess and a woman. And I'm just super thrilled to have you on the show, Monica. Welcome.
My goodness. Thank you, Evelyn.
I could go on, but we only have half an hour. So.
That's right.
So, Monica, what I really want to talk to you about is everything. And I know that's not the most focused approach of going about things. So, can we hear a little bit about your journey as a woman? I mean, I think the journey that fascinates me is you were a married woman, you have children, and then you created this wild, juicy, ecstatic, phenomenal life. I would love to hear a little bit about that journey, please.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting, even the way you set it up, right? I was married with children, and then I created. That's right, right, which is really interesting. I think there is something that women do that I know that I did when we step into a role. You know, in fact, that was my second marriage. I had a very brief first marriage, and the weirdest thing happened during that brief first marriage. Like, I found myself all of a sudden like cooking everything from scratch, and like I had become like this Italian nonna, and I was only like 24 years old or something. So yeah, I think there was definitely this stage of my life of sort of creating home and creating children and all of that, and there were dynamics in that relationship that weren't really working, but something happened when I came out of it. Some completely new energy just sort of infused, my body, my awareness, my everything. And I think in some ways it was, there's that intense, the creation of children is an intense creative force, right? That comes out of us as women. But we always have that creative force, right? Like, it doesn't just happen and then go away. And I think that force inside me got activated through, creating beings. But then I think there was this next stage where it was like, okay, well, now what do I do with this? And I think that was, of course, this is a little bit in hindsight, right? I mean, at the time, I didn't really know what was happening. I just was, I was just going through this time of everything feeling different, everything feeling a very different energy and movement in my life. And when I look back at it now, I realized that was sort of the next chapter of the creative force in my life, kind of coming alive. And so it came alive, it impacted my sexuality, impacted my creativity, impacted my, energy to do business and to be in the world, and, all of these things.
It was fascinating hearing that, is that if I think about a marriage and a marriage breaking down, it's easy to imagine the kind of sadness and the depression that could follow. But you're talking about creativity that's bursting through and a force that's coming through.
Well, it's funny. It's interesting that you say that. There's this beautiful book years ago. I think it just had the 25th anniversary of its first printing. That's called Care of the Soul by Thomas More. And I was so grateful that I had read that book long before this phase in my life, because there was the depression. I mean, there was the sadness. I talked about, dropping my kids off at school and then picking them up hours later, and I had been on the couch the whole time, and I kind of got up and like, oh, did I do anything? That sort of depression fog, if you will. But the weirdest thing, Evelyn, is that while I was just sitting on the couch doing nothing, couldn't do my business, couldn't function, probably the definition of depression in some ways, I'm writing erotic poetry. I mean, where is that coming from? And I'm asking myself, I'm looking around going, where is this voice coming from? and it was prophetic in a way. It was a part of myself that was like banging on the door going like, let me out, you know? And I think that sometimes we're so quick to, you know, and I have to tread really lightly here because I'm not saying anything whatsoever about the choices that people make around depression. And I understand it to be, you know, an illness. So I get misunderstood a lot on this topic. But there is a place sometimes that Thomas More talks about in Care of the Soul. It's like sometimes we have to know the difference between kind of a depressive episode that requires, you know, some type of, you know, chemical remedy or whatever, and what I was going through, which is just like a dark night of the soul, you know, and it took that post-divorce, it was separation at that time, depression and everything else. It was like this going in order for something else to be born, and that's how I think of it now.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. And I like that you're treading carefully around the depression thing, but it's also really important to distinguish that not every depression is a medical condition. There is
Yes.
depression, a medical condition. That's not what we're talking about, but there's a dark night of the soul. And I'm experiencing a lot of that myself. And because most of the talk of depression is medical, it's really easy to get lost in that. Oh, what's wrong with me? Oh, do I have a thing now? And no, there is this really important birth taking place.
Yeah.
We become where we're the caterpillar in that cocoon, really, and it's dark and then it's really tight and there's not much going on. So
Yeah.
I really relate to that.
I think one of the ways that I came to sort of this iteration of myself, and I think if we're being honest, like we have iterations of ourselves throughout our life, you know, and I think that time was really instructive, you know, where I came to this like liberating aliveness, like where does, and I think that sometimes when people think aliveness, it's like they hear that and they think, oh, I have to always be up, I have to always be on, you know, like we have this, and it's like, no, that's not it. You know, what it is that most people just have such a narrow bandwidth for how much they can feel. You know, it's like, oh, if we feel too much, you know, we're too big, we're too, you know, too much, right? I feel like we're constantly bouncing. I felt this for myself at a certain point. I was constantly bouncing between, I'm too much, I'm not enough, I'm too much, I'm not enough. And really, it was like in this little teeny tiny space that I'm bouncing on the walls. So when I talk about liberating aliveness, or when I talk about that was like a dark night of the soul, it's about having a wider bandwidth for feeling, you know, more capacity, and what more capacity for feeling actually leads to is more resilience. And I feel as though what we're up against right now is most people just are not very resilient. I think that's why we go running so quickly to something that will make us feel less, you know.
That's interesting. So having more capacity to feel, you say, brings more resilience.
Yes.
To me, when I hear that, I've just watched the Anthony Robbins documentary, "I'm Not Your Guru," and he talks about
Just watched what? I'm sorry.
The documentary on Anthony Robbins called "I'm Not Your Guru."
Ah, yes.
And he talks about that you get in life, you don't get what you deserve, you get what you tolerate.
Mm.
So I'm wondering, as you speak of resilience, I'm like, does that mean that you can take more shit?
So, well, it's a really interesting, that's an interesting twist, right? That you can take more shit. That I would say it means that you can face more challenge. You can be grounded longer in chaos. You can sustain ambiguity and chaos. These are the precursors of creativity. You know, if you can't withstand ambiguity, then you actually can't create anything, because ambiguity is a precursor to creativity, right? So if we can't withstand challenges, if we can't withstand chaos, if we can't withstand ambiguity, if we can't withstand a minute of not knowing without losing ourselves, you know, or without running to, you know, something, uh, then, you know, we're not building a muscle. I mean, if you think about um, what happens when we go to the gym. I mean, you don't get stronger by not lifting very much. You get stronger by lifting a lot. Right? No, that's it. I'm good. It's like, that's not doing anything. Why do we think that our emotional capacity is different than the way our physical capacity works, right? Everything works on the same principles, the same scientific principles, right? It's just that we can see our physical body. We can see our, our muscles being built, but we can't see our emotional capacity being built. So sometimes we don't trust or realize that it works the same way.
And that there's so much in there already. I have like 3 different strands I could go on to. But we have the capacity for to feel more and to hold more emotion, also as a container to be more creative from. Strikes me as important, especially because people who watch my things are often very artistically minded, very creative people. And that bleeds into this whole notion of this oscillation between being too much and feeling too much and feeling not enough. So I'm also wondering that a person that you have a big personality and that's not new. It's like almost, how can somebody with such confidence and big personality feel too much? Surely you thrive in that.
It's really interesting. It's I'm not even sure what big personality means in some ways. Like I do know, but I kind of don't. Sometimes I think that personality is a shield, and I think there have been times that I have used it that way, and I've become aware of that. This is sort of I'm moving into a different stage in my life now, and what I know is that that part of me that maybe could be described as a big personality was a shield to intimacy. So I don't experience myself that way quite as much, maybe as I used to, and maybe I have been called intimidating, which I think is different than big personality, right? Yeah. I think that powerful energy and big personality are 2 different things.
Me too. I agree with
you.
Yeah.
And I think that sometimes we all get intimidated by people or a lot of people get intimidated by someone that they feel has, a powerful presence or a powerful energy, because I think it just becomes a mirror, in some kind of ways. Most of the people that end up working with me, it sometimes takes people years to decide that they're going to work with me. And I don't find out until later that people have been sort of watching and thinking about it and, whatever for years. And I've had no idea, and I think it's that it's like we have to get to a certain point in ourselves before we feel like we're going to even approach someone that has some type of an energetic field. So I don't know if that answers your question, but I think there's an important distinction there. I think people are afraid of being perceived in the way that I'm often perceived. I'm perceived as something like bigger or larger than life or intimidating or something like that. And I think that we get afraid, and so we try very hard not to be that. And I think we do ourselves a disservice.
Yeah, I agree. And there's fear of rejection, of not being accepted, and then ending up lonely. But what really struck me there when you said, when you just talked about the difference between personality and, what is it, big personality and being
a powerful energy versus a big personality. Mm-hmm.
When you were experiencing yourself as the personality, because you were using it as a shield, you would have at the same time experienced yourself less, and therefore that would make sense to then not feel enough. So I see how that would work.
Yeah, I did. I did a talk, actually, as part of a group that I think we've both belonged to in the past. I did a 10 by 10 talk as part of the Litvin group. It's on my website. And I actually talked about, that goes back kind of years and years ago to when I was younger. I realized that, you know, if you could come off, I lost my virginity non-consensually when I was 14. And people react to that many different ways. You know, people who have been sexually assaulted have many, some become very fearful, some become, you know, I kind of went the other way. I realized that if I could look like I had it all going on, you know, I could protect myself by intimidating others. That could be, you know, so boys became intimidated. I never got asked out in high school by a high school boy. I ended up kind of going out with older people at that time. And it became a very effective shield to kind of look like I had it all going on, you know? So I developed that very early. It took me a really long time to realize, you know, that that's what it was, because it wasn't conscious. You don't do this at 14. You know, you just sort of start to notice, if I'm this way, then this happens. And if I'm this way, this happens. A lot of our personality, if you will, gets developed totally unconsciously as a reaction to things that happen to us when we're, you know, quite young. So people's personalities are not very interesting to me. And I think that that's also what throws people off sometimes, right? Because everyone is using their personality in some kind of way as a means of, as a currency, right? Yeah. So when you meet someone who's not interested in your personality, they want to go like this and see like what's behind there.
Very disconcerting.
Very disconcerting.
Like, yeah. Where am I going here? I was secure a minute ago. Now
yeah.
I'm sure.
Yeah, wait, you're only supposed to see this. What are you looking behind there for?
I'm doing my confidence act. Wait,
yes.
Don't destroy it.
Yes.
Yeah. So I'm going to get really insecure in a minute.
But the truth is, I mean, it's so interesting, right? It's like, that's the first reaction is like, wait, like people get off guard. But then the truth is we actually all want to be seen behind that. Right. That's our deepest desire, right? And that's why people have this push and pull, this, oh my goodness, what do you mean you're looking behind the curtain? And then you're like, oh my God, please see me, because this front that I have put on is exhausting. Right.
Yeah. And then you become that person in whose presence I'm allowed to be real and yeah. experience myself maybe in a way that I haven't before. And that's where it becomes really fascinating. Yeah. And so your journey has developed from the first erotic poetry writing. you didn't leave it there, did you?
No, I sure didn't.
Mrs. Day.
Well, you know, years and years before, it was sort of part of, you know, we lose pieces of ourselves along the way for various reasons. Some of them are good, some of them are not so good. And one of them was that, you know, I used to perform when I was, you know, younger. I read poetry. I did all kinds of artsy, you know, things. And I had lost track of that part of myself for sure in the midst of kind of the whole married and mom, you know, routine. So yeah, I started performing the erotic poetry, and then that kind of had me tumble down a whole kind of rabbit hole, if you will. I did a one-woman show, which was one of the most potent and healing things I'd ever done. It was actually called Song of the Sacred Whore, just to have a little bit of a racy title there, which people had a really interesting reaction to. But for me, it was really an exploration, not only of sexuality, you know, mine and others. It was actually partly autobiographical and it was partly biblical. I had all kinds of biblical women in there, you know, women who over my lifetime, their stories had influenced me. You know, there was the Virgin Mary, there was Mary Magdalene, there was, can't remember all the rest of them now. There were about 4 or 5 different biblical women in there. And yeah, I found that going through the doorway of art and creativity was really healing for me. I think that, again, we live in a culture where most of where people go to explore these things are, therapy. And again, I'm not anti-therapy any way that I'm not anti, depression medication. But for me, I think that we have many forms of medicine.
Mhm.
And I find that creativity is a very powerful and potent form of medicine. I think you would, agree. You're
Would concur. Yeah.
yes. That's a place where we're yeah, similar. And over time, I'll say that I also landed with that. That was a super potent exploration for me, uh, and if you notice, we talked a little bit before we started. You're like, what do you call yourself? I know you don't say sex coach. I know you're, and I don't. What I discovered about sexuality is that it is foundational to who we are. It is part of our foundation, and yet it's not the focus.
Mm.
So in my practice, sexuality is a foundation of what we look at. So is creativity. These are parts of who we are. I call it our source code. Right? Like we're more familiar with computers than we are with ourselves. So I use the language of computers to teach people something about themselves, right? So underneath, like even just what you and I are talking on right now, right? If you were to take away the pretty front end user, our pictures and all of that, behind it is just all code, right? Like the Matrix, right? Streaming code. Well, that's what's happening inside of us all the time as, human beings. We have various aspects of ourselves that are kind of firing all the time. We have our five senses, we have, our creativity, we have all of these things, our sexuality. This is all what makes us human. This is happening all the time in the background, you know. So I gradually kind of saw this over a period of a couple decades, of swimming in these waters. And so for me now, sexuality is just an aspect of a human that is important, but it isn't like the sole focus. I guess I have a challenge with kind of the fact that we cut people up into little pieces, and like when people say to me, what type of coach you are, like I get a little bit of an attitude about that, because I don't think people should be like carved up into little pieces and you go over here and talk to this one about this and over here. And that's why I talk about liberating aliveness. I want people first and foremost to be awake and aware and alive. And the minute you're awake and aware and alive, you look around the life that you created when you were like numb and kind of half sleeping, and you're like, whose life is this? Who thought that job was a good idea? Who thought, right? Right? So you can't, you know nothing about this. This is the part where I stop talking.
Yeah. Thank you, everyone, and thanks for watching, and we'll see you on.
But it is true. It really is. And so to me, and most people, by the time they cross my door, that's started to happen, or they know it needs to happen, or whatever. And so that's why I can't carve people up into little tiny pieces and say, okay, let's go work. Go ahead. Oh, good. Now you can't work on your sex life and have it not impact every other part of your life.
Yeah.
You can't.
We had a conversation right about that, and that's how you became that coach that looked at all the deeper aspects.
Yeah, because the minute people would wake up in the first couple months, of working on their sex life in the way that I do, which has nothing to do with sex, by the way. I used to have to put a thing on my on my website that's like, there is no hands-on work involved with this. I think for a while the joke with my family was I was pretty sure my family thought I was an escort. I think that, and they just became very polite. They didn't want to know. They were like, yeah, we don't want to know.
And then you are just talking about it.
Yeah, but people would just have all these like awakenings in a few months, and then I was like, well, what are we going to send them off to 20 different places? And the truth is, most practitioners in therapy, in coaching, and whatever, they're afraid of the sexuality piece, and or they as soon as they hit it, they either try to shut it down in themselves or the others, or they go to boundaries. Oh, I have professional boundaries. I'm sorry, but what the F is that? I mean, I'm sorry. I mean, I do know what a boundary is. Let me be clear. My boundaries are rock solid. Like, whatever. I'm just saying they resort to boundaries when they don't know what to do with the energy that they're afraid of. And that is something that has been hurting a lot of us for a long time.
Yeah. There's a whole big discussion about boundaries and what they are and where they're useful and who are they really useful for, which you can say for another time. But I think you really touch on something very important, which is that the wholeness of a person is what really, I don't want to say should, but I kind of feel should come first, rather than the puzzle. Yeah, we're going to do this, and then you sort your finances out, and then we'll look at your happiness, and then we'll look at your relationship. And hopefully, if you get all these things from the outside wheel, then it will all be great, because you'll have the man of your life, and he will make you so happy. But the happiness, of course, comes from your inside, which you know can't lie, and blah, blah, blah. So I love the way you approach it. You're like, look, I'm not going to cut you into pieces. You're not going to cut me into a piece. Here's where we're going to go. And once we're not going to argue with orgasm, are we?
I've never won one with mine yet.
I am very argumentative sometimes, but I've not been inclined to argue with orgasm. It takes you over, you do whatever you do, and that's it. That is so big. So I love the concept of coming alive and then looking from here. To me, that makes a whole lot of sense, and I love the way you were wording that, because we do live in in our industry, there's a whole lot more talk about the scrunching down than the opening up. So
I think I often tell people that if you look around at natural processes, they're very instructive. There is a certain messiness and chaos to the universe, and there's also order that is uncanny, right? Both of those things are true. And so why do we think that we as beings are any different than the way every other thing on the planet and in the universe works, right? We are the same as every other part of the universe. We have our messy and our chaotic parts, and then we have our parts that have a lot of order to them. And if we could just get one with that, it would make a huge difference in our lives. But instead, we're always fighting everything and each other, and it's very interesting.
Keeps us very
interesting. Keeps us something.
I would love to talk to you for so much longer, but I am aware of time. So let me slowly or very effectively wrap this up. So I would love for Birgit with tie a little bow around it, and put some order into this whole thing. Like only I can. So when people work with you, I would love for our viewers to take away something to take home, and also to know where they could get more of you if they are intrigued, which I'm expecting they would be, or I am. So,
that would be lovely.
Yeah, where do we find more about you? Obviously, I'm going to link to that talk that you gave, because that's on public domains. I'm going to put the link underneath the video in the description. But where will we find out more about the work that you do? I know there's a program that you do called Source Code.
It is, yeah. Well, all of it can be found on my website, which is really easy because it's my name, monicaday.com. That's easy. And in fact, that talk that you're going to link to is on there. A couple of my talks are on there. And my program. So I work with both men and women. I have sort of a women's track called the Infinite Woman, where I do work with just women, but everything else I do is both men and women. And I do have Source Code, which in some ways is kind of the, what would you call it? Like the touchstone, or kind of the I don't know, everybody has different
Signature
names for it.
Is it a
Signature program. Yeah. Yes. It's that. I'm terrible at all that, and anything that feels like it has that kind of pretentious energy, I throw up a little bit. It doesn't serve me well in a marketing environment, but that's okay. Yeah, but source code in some ways is like the introduction to, I guess you would say, like my approach, my philosophy. That's about a 3.5-day program that's coming up at the end of October. And my Infinite Woman program. Sometimes, I talked a little bit, I just did a blog about why we do some things in affinity groups, right? Because I do think there's a way sometimes we have to like take a minute on our own, so for women to just go off and have a minute to be with ourselves as women, and what is that relationship? Because it's not like it's all hunky-dory. This whole like, hey, sister, that sisterhood shit is some bullshit. Really, like it is so not authentic in so many ways, right? So that is important to me. Spend a little time just with women. So I do that in the summer. So that's coming up. It's usually in July. I know this will be more than just right now. So it's usually around the third, fourth week in July. This year it's the fourth week in July. So those are some ways people can find me. And I have just found that people, when they read anything I've written or they see a talk I give, it's not a head decision usually. That's why people are like, oh, give people their pain points. I don't have to tell you how you're in pain. And I don't even want to, it's more like this feeling of like, there's something not quite right. And it's just, there's something, and it's just like when we start to wake up to the fact that we've constructed a life that's not a reflection of who we really are, and it gets uncomfortable. That's really the place that people walk in my door or they stumble across me. And I can't tell anybody what that looks like in their life, but it's like it's almost a sensation in your body.
Yeah.
You absolutely know.
I love that. I think this is hugely powerful. And as you were saying that, I thought, yeah, and that's why you stand out.
Mm.
That formula, you're not going that mainstream way. You don't even have to talk about the pain. You just get it on a more visceral level. And the other thing is you're able to communicate that very, very eloquently.
Thank you.
You're welcome. And thank you very much.
Yeah.
I hope everyone at least.
I'll throw out one thing I forgot to mention, which is there is a book. There is a published book, yes, called Play Wild, Stay Safe, The Guide to Giving and Receiving. And that's a really great book for people either in relationship or who want to be in a relationship. It's a sexy book. Although it's not specific, around sex, but it's more like the energy of intimacy and how does that play out in our lives. So that is a really fun way to get a taste of things that I teach, just by grabbing a book on Amazon. Yeah.
Beautiful book that has also some stunning imagery. It's very,
I know,
very artistically
yes,
as well. So
photographer Robert Neroni, yeah, he did an amazing job. So thanks for letting me throw that out there too.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Monica. And thank you everyone for watching. Have a wonderful day, evening, and we'll see you all very soon.